All right. This is a reply video, a thank you video, and some further thoughts on a few different areas, three different areas that Harvey or Mr. Iron Horse was very kind enough to have gone over and explained for me. Harvey, I mean, I'm obviously subscribed to your channel, of course. It's actually probably the first chainsaw performance channel that I had ever subscribed to. I don't know how on earth I didn't catch the video. I'm embarrassed. I don't know how on earth that happened. I would expect the YouTube algorithm would have thrown it to me forever ago, but it was about a week ago that I finished watching one of your videos, and the suggested videos, my name in the title catches my eye, and of course I open it up thinking it's a new release, and it's not a new release. So yeah, it was. My excitement turned to embarrassment and, crap. I hope I hope he realizes that's me being not on top of my notifications and whatnot, and not, that I saw it and just didn't even reply or something. I mean, I can't even imagine. I am more than eager to talk on these things, and I am filming right now my third and final version of this, so that I can keep it nice and succinct. Because it's very easy to go a little bit further on these topics. Harvey, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and that's why I love your channel, is because you're able to keep things nice and dense and packed, and, really get into the stuff. So without further ado, I'm going to keep it to the point and on these three topics. Now, I want to start off by saying that at no point did I disagree with anything in your video. I know that you're on point and accurate with every last bit, and furthermore, it sounds like the main. I don't want to say disagreement. It sounds like the thing that you thought that I was having the biggest problem on, or one of the two things that you thought I was having the biggest problem on, was when I misspoke and I referred to hurting power by roughing up the band or the transfers, and I wasn't precise enough. I was picturing a cylinder that I had that ate a ring, and I was picturing like a gouged up squish band, which of course would hurt performance, or gouged up transfer tunnels or intake tract. I absolutely think that the porting, the surfaces of the ports for intake port and transfer tunnel loopage, definitely you do not want anything slick, because that doesn't promote keeping the fuel atomized. And in fact, the ridges that you carve and that I've mimicked on intake ceilings, as well as having a hook on the intake ceiling so that the incoming charge is forced downwards, all aid towards both fuel suspension, keeping fuel in suspension and atomized, as well as kicking charge right where it belongs. Especially sort of kicking, knocking the cylinder back so that the intake is shot more of a straight shot into the crankcase. Over time, you'll notice that saws, obviously, Iron Horse knows this. I'm kind of speaking to everyone else that may not have noticed this. I've only recently noticed this myself, that more modern saws have the cylinder cocked back more and more and more. And obviously, it doesn't affect the exhaust expulsion. It's just about the intake being aimed into that crankcase, a tighter shot. I'm sorry, I should have introduced that's kind of point number one. Iron Horse, your video started out mentioning that a point from one of your prior videos about how increased intake velocity allows for longer intake duration, which I'm going to have to rewatch. I'm going to have to find and watch the intake video, or the video where that was mentioned, because the first thing I think of is that timing for intake is half of the intake open duration is during the compression stroke, when the piston's coming down and the intake port's still open. So of course that's not our super desirable part of our two strokes function. It's, as I understand it, it's what's causing the spit back that we get through the carb into our filters that we have to account for with baffles and everything. At any rate, I guess I immediately wondered, but it was out of context because you were just doing an addendum. But it immediately made me wonder, is this in the context of a fully widened intake port? Because as far as I understand, we really wouldn't want to be increasing duration until we've maximized width. So when you mentioned a tightening of it, I mean, I immediately start wondering if it's restriction at the port, or if it's, for instance, widening the outer flange, the entry flange, just to change the divergence within the tunnel, like not changing the inner port window at all, and just widening the where the boot mates up to it, so that you have a bit of taper there. Because we both know that taper one way or the other, in one direction, divergence in one direction or the other on any of the intake tract, or especially the exhaust tract, is very, very potent stuff. That's how tuned pipes work. That's the entire principle behind them. So, anyways, the first main point was pistons, and I fully share your fears of going too far on pistons. I actually saw your newer piston video this afternoon, which was fantastic. I got a couple visual aids here to show some things that I wanted to go over, because I don't disagree with one thing. As far as I can tell, I don't disagree with you on anything about pistons, but I think that you think that I'm going more aggressive than I am, or rather, that there's a chance that I might be sabotaging things in a way that I'm not realizing. So I'm going to start off with this demo pair. This is a pair of 54s, flat tops. When I see something like this, and I look at the casting for the outer wrist pin or gudgeon pin boss, I see that there's about 2 millimeters of extra flat material, about 2.5, almost 3 on this one, and this one's a much taller boss that connects pretty smooth into the side, the lower window panes. This one is as well with a pretty pronounced mid, and the inner window pane, as it were, isn't just on the side but on the bottom. On this one, it's on the side only with a pretty stiff upwards taper. So I mean, looking at this side window pane right here, you know that you can cut some of that off. I mean, you don't need a 1-inch flare for this thing to connect tight to the top. You don't have to go super tight, but I'm pretty confident that we're not going to see the boss rip off of the crown here. Also, when it comes to like the piston legs, or the bottoms of the windows, their strength matters way more this way, obviously, because the piston slamming into the walls and whatnot, the skirts slamming into the walls. Their lateral strength isn't as important. It's not seeing anywhere near as much force. So because of that, if you were to take a piston and reduce 10% this way vertically, that's a lot more dangerous to it than this way. I mean, you don't want to go super skinny, but more out of here means more room for charge to come through the windows on a saw that has piston fed transfers. And that actually becomes kind of important on the overboard MS660 setups, because sadly, unless you get the Wiseco pistons for 661, which still would need some work, shouldn't even mention that, I'm not going to edit one of those. The reality is these guys are coming with skirts, or I'm sorry, these are coming about 78 thousandths shorter than a regular 660 slug, and 73 thousandths of that is in the skirt. Now, that necessarily makes it so that the windows on this are shorter than on a regular 660 to have the same window pane bottoms. So even though that larger 7.5% larger displacement jug, now it needs more charge, obviously, because it's a larger top end, so we want to increase flow, but we have smaller windows. Enlarging the windows not only allows that, and reduces, when this guy's going through the hole through bottom dead center, there's a amount of charge in the crankcase that he's going to displace through the transfers, no matter what, whether or not blowdown was not satisfactorily satisfactorily achieved and there's still pressure, even if those transfers are way too tight, it doesn't matter. He still has to displace that charge. The more you tighten it up, the more friction and drag you're putting onto the slug, and the more velocity that the transfer charge will have when it squirts into the cylinder, which means more mixing and more short circuiting and more charge loss. Usually you have about a 1.5 top end to bottom end, like a 1.5 to 1 ratio. And my understanding is it's like about 80% fill. Like when the crankcase's charge comes up through the transfer loop, and recharges the cylinder, and that's 100% done. At that point, the top end, it's only about 80% fresh charge. The other 20% is still exhaust product, and that's in an idealized scenario. Like that's like the absolute best. That's like hypothetically. In practice, the exhaust and the charge are, mixing up with each other, and you're losing more. And the more turbulence you have, the more you lose, as far as I can tell. As far as I've read, as far as I can tell, as far as it makes sense, the more that you swirl the exhaust and the good charge, the more that you're going to lose charge. And the more diluted, well, either way you want to phrase it, the more diluted your charge will be for your next stroke's ignition. So yeah, as far as I can tell, we want our transfers. We don't want to increase. Actually, with transfers, there's no real worries about backflow. So I guess increasing timing doesn't really bother us so much. But blowdown is always the concern there. So realistically, wide transfers, windows and lowers that don't need to be huge, but they need to be large enough to accommodate the uppers. Any wider, and it doesn't matter. But any tighter, in your inducing restriction. And as far as I understand, that actually is losses to the third power when you're putting force onto the piston, whether it's through insufficient blowdown when the transfers crack, or too tight transfers, or over lead on your spark. When you're hammering against the motion, against the motion of the piston, it's losses to the third, because power is computed at the shaft, and when you hit the piston, it doesn't touch the shaft until it goes through the small end, the big end, and then the shaft itself. So that's how Jennings explains it in the book, or at least my understanding of it. I'm happy to put the page number in the comments if anyone asks. And as far as the circlips on the pistons go, actually, the pair of 54 millimeter ones, there's obviously, like I said, we know that this flare doesn't need to be that wide. We don't want to touch our skirt, of course. Well, maybe with some 320 grit and break all the edges, which you mentioned in your recent video, breaking the sharp edges, which, of course, I fully recommend anyone do. You should never just put that in. The worst thing you could do is not break any edge, build it up, turn it over, and then just start going, full throttle, out of wood, no load. I actually build the top end, smear it together, smear every part with marine grease, and wipe the marine grease off with a rag that I've wetted with 2-stroke oil. And then I assemble everything. I put my drill onto the flywheel's retaining nut, and I turn it, probably 100 to 300 RPM for a little bit. And I make sure, and then I put a flashlight in there. I make sure I don't see any lines on the cylinder. I turn it by hand to make sure it's not feeling like it's kind of got some resistance. Well, anywhere besides top dead center, or anywhere besides when it's hitting top center, bottom, or when the magneto is lining up with the coil. But otherwise, it should be spinning nice and smooth. If it's not, then there's a problem, and I don't want to turn the engine over and have it running at 3,000 RPM. Actually, as far as sanding edges, I even do that to my my cobber rings. I very, very carefully take 320, 400 something grit paper, and we'll just gently rub just that 90-degree edge on the top and the bottom of the ring, just to break that sharp edge. That's all. Just the slightest little smoothing. Harvey, I love how you showed the technique, your technique, and mentioned when you're doing that, you're keeping your file, you're not going against it, you're keeping more of the file in contact. I find that keeps things way more symmetrical. You did mention porting the piston to achieve altered timing, like for instance how on the exhaust side of the piston one could instead of raising your exhaust roof by 10 thousandths or 12 thousandths to achieve a degree of alteration, you could do the same by cutting away at your crown. I would say that when it comes to chainsaws, especially ones where you can just buy cheap top-end kits, I'd say that the smarter move is doing everything you can with the piston. I mean, I'm sorry, with the cylinder. And then to your piston, it's not that I say don't do it. It's not that I think an optimum is to do nothing to the piston. For instance, this is the first piston that I ran on my first 56 millimeter build. The porting of this cylinder wasn't great, and didn't run it for very long, and it doesn't show super great on camera, but the piston wasn't, it was rubbing more than you'd want. Still has the grooves and all, but at any rate, you can see on the top, this would normally have the arrow pointed out towards your exhaust. It doesn't because it was sanded first with 150 grit, and then with 220 grit. So that when the exhaust cracks open, instead of this being a flat disc, it's got a little bit of, I mean, we're only talking about something that's gonna, I don't even know if it took a whole thousandth of an inch off, probably like a half or 1.5 thousandths of an inch off. Now, I always do that kind of smoothing on things, of course, with the port in mind. But this is a more extreme example, or a more illuminating example, however you want to call it. This is doing transfers. This piston's a display piston. I messed up on the gudgeon pin bosses and went too far, as Harvey, as you noted, is very easy to happen if one's playing with fire like that. As far as smoothness is, like I was saying before, you know, we want laminar flow through our transfer tracks, through our intake. I'd say that we'd also want it on our chamber and on the pop-up part of our disc. We'd want our band to be either smooth and flat and shiny, or to be shiny like the side of a piston with its grooves coming inwards, you know, the whole way. At any rate, though, as far as porting or edging your piston to achieve port alterations, this is a I'm sorry, this is a transfer a transfer porting alteration that's not really a timing thing so much as it's a flow thing. When the transfers crack, I drew it in with marker on this one so you can see that I have this little groove that's about halfway into the cuts halfway into the crown. This is a piston that would not have a top ring. The ring locator pin was out of place. This was going to be run bottom ring only in one of the 56 millimeter jugs that has the ring of death unplated top, so you couldn't run a top ring anyway. So that's how I was going to set it up. Was building it a little bit too extreme, as Harvey noted, messing around with the gudgeon pin, the outside of the gudgeon pin boss, and I went too far. And now some of the areas, actually it's really just one spot, but one spot's too many. If there's one spot that's a little too tight that you're worried of, then you've ruined it. You know, as he said, it's junk. At any rate, though, you can see I've marked this one right here to show to show where I smoothed it, and you can see that it's off center to the back of the cylinder, to the intake side. It's deepest right here, so that when those transfers crack, when this comes below and cracks the transfers, the gas isn't going to it's not going to be able to shoot out straight, because the first part that cracks isn't going to be a homogeneous flat top. It's going to be the center right here, but the transfer kind of is shaped like that, so it's really going to be when those two made up. And then when this starts really exposing the transfer, then it will really open the ramp up that pushes it backwards. Smoothing the front, smoothing I must have worn it off by holding it, but smoothing the intake side lip a little bit. I mean, breaking the 90-degree edges is what I think of as more in blueprinting, and doing things like that are more like custom work, whereas breaking sharp edges should be done no matter what, I believe. The things like this, like carving in for significantly improved oil flow to your small end bearing, which is a notoriously under-oiled spot. Now, obviously, I would finish smoothing this out if I was going to use this piston, but I can't, and I'll show why in a second. However, this type of gap between the two legs, I mean, I don't have enough experience, but I don't think we're going to see metal on metal squish, and fold and bend right here. So it does look kind of a daring carve, but at the end of the day, I don't think we're going to see a failure mode with a crack induced right here. It's just the way that it moves. I mean, that's the thing. Every time I work with one of these and I'm porting one of these, I'm thinking very much about the way that the connecting rod is throwing force onto it and the way that the cylinder is supporting it. One other thing to keep in consideration is that it's not just about strength, but about mass. You remove enough mass, and now heat transference is sabotaged as well. When it comes to the outer edges here, like the wrist pin or gudgeon pin bosses that keep the circlip held, that's more of like a work saw, I guess, one you'd call it. Although, to be fair, the one that's in there is still closer to 1 millimeter like this. Harvey, I'm definitely not trying to disagree with you and say, oh yeah, that's fine, that'll hold forever. You know, I was a bit worried putting one in there, and it's held. The thing is my understanding of this is that the way that the pin works is through lateral. I'm sorry. The circlip exerts its retention on that pin, not by being so strong the pin can't push it or something, but by this thing is a spring, and we're squishing it and putting it into that track, that groove, and it wants to spring into it. And this thing is built in such a way that, and I know you know all this, of course, I'm not explaining something to you that you already know. I'm kind of putting it aloud how I see it in hopes that you can tell me where I'm missing, if anything, on this. But when this side doesn't have a gudgeon pin, obviously, it doesn't have a circlip. If it did, when this started to come out, that circlip, it's only making contact with the outer edge of this. So this, in effect, especially if you sanded the edge, I sand the edges of anything. Like I said, that includes a wrist pin, yes. Very gently, very carefully, very minimally, but nothing, including a bearing, a smaller bearing. That gets 400 grit, just gently by hand, and not 5 passes or something. But yeah, at any rate, the circlip is working to keep this thing from shooting out, not by how strong the metal is or something like that, but because when this tries to push its way out, what it does is it seats the circlip tighter and tighter into its groove. So failure mode, as it were, would have to be either smashing the metal out on the outer boss, like literally smashing and chunking the metal out, which this one is quite close to allowing to happen, or shattering of the circlip itself. And I'm not sure if shattering of the circlip is a common thing. However, being that I can't use this piston and it kind of became like more of a display dummy piston, it got tossed around in my parts and junk drawers for quite a bit. And because I had a wrist pin in it with one side pinned with a circlip, but not the other side, what that created was some lateral force of the wrist pin against that thin little outer boss on the far side of the circlip, which normally wouldn't be there if that was inside of the sealed engine, mind you. But because it wasn't in a sealed engine and it had that pin hanging out, it created a couple spots that I could see are weak spots, and I didn't actually go and break them with my finger, but I could if I wanted to, and I cannot use that piston as a single ring piston now. As far as squish velocity is concerned, in the decking versus band question, I don't even think that's a question. I really think that it's all pretty straightforward once you understand it all. And I think that Harvey's explanation in that video in his video reply to me, was outstanding. I really wish that I was able to view it before having had to read Jennings and Blair's books several times to basically get most of the way there on my own. But it was fantastic to be able to have it all wrapped up and understand it all with your explanation, Iron Horse. As far as squish velocity, though, there is one thing that I want to mention when it comes to the angles of the bands. Let's say that we're talking about a given saw. It comes to you, you get it, you check it, it's got 40,000 squish. You say, I'm not going to waste all that fuel that's doing nothing besides compressing my combustion chamber charge and keeping it in place. It's not really burning. I guess it helps towards the liquid cool aspect that gasoline does, but you reduce your 40 thousandths to 20 thousandths, cutting that loss in half. And at the same time, a tighter squish land, let's call it, that area in between the crown and the squish band. A tighter squish land means more pressure being exerted in that ring of squish land around that combustion, around the charge that's in the combustion chamber. And we want that. We want that to be nice and tight so that that flame propagates as quickly as possible. So tightness and velocity of what's coming out of here, in acting as a ring, squishing into the outside edge of the combustion pocket. The higher that you can make the velocity, the more that it's going to keep the pocket tight, and the more that it's going to cause turbulence, because as it presses against the outer edge, there's no way, of course, that it's, you know, pressing evenly at every degree. so it's helping to induce turbulence, I guess you would say. But onto the idea of tapering a squish band. I'm not sure about I'm not sure about the degrees that are good for this, like whether it's more like 2 degrees or 8 degrees, or I don't know. On OPE forums, they told me that I ruined the cylinder because I made it 7 degrees, I believe it was. I ended up stealing a flange from that one of these flanges. These Farmer Tech jugs are so cheap that, you know, if you feel you mess something up, you just try again. At any rate, though, let's picture that you have 20,000 squish. Your area in Squish Land, or the volume of Squish Land, when the piston's at top dead center, and you got your 20,000 squish on your flat band, your area under the curve, or rather area under the line, would be identical in the same if you rotate your squish band on the central axis, meaning that you've dropped the far end to 18 thousandths and the inside to 22. You still have the exact same amount of fuel being trapped in here, but now it's coming in at a higher velocity. And I think that one could make a pretty good argument that you could do something like that, where you have identical area under the curve, because you've tilted it, you know, not tilted it, but I mean obviously you dropped it and then cut the band. But if you've done that in such a way, especially where if you have the ability to do precision work on a pop-up or a dome, if you can do that in a way where the dome is an angled edge dome and it's just right beyond the line, maybe even on the line of where the band ends and the chamber begins, then when that charge is being squished in right at that important moment at top dead center, it's going to have like a little bit of a kick effect, like a ramp effect, that's going to increase the pressure of the squish and the ring tightening in, but it's also going to increase turbulence. And remember, it's only a moment later, you know, 15 degrees after top dead center, when the piston's coming down, when peak pressure in that cylinder is achieved. 15, 20 degrees after top dead center. And that moment of peak pressure, that determines the power of your saw. Or actually, I'm sorry, it's the average cylinder pressure by times RPMs. So that determines your BMEP for the saw. But your average cylinder pressure is most influenced by the ignition event, of course, and the way to take the most advantage of that is while the charge is still tapped and tight on top. Anyways, that covers everything except for the timing, but as you said, you're afraid to get into it. I gotta tell you, I'm more afraid to get into it. You gotta have a strobe light to even figure out your baseline, and figuring out the math involved for the gains involved seems very trivial. It would still be required for optimization. However, I gotta say, taking 10 thousandths or 20 thousandths off a key and calling it a day on an MS660 does seem to work. And I suspect that copying that, like going on Google, finding out what people do for that saw, I suspect that probably will work for common models. And thankfully, that's what I'm working with for my 590 or 2511T, you know, stuff like that. Anyways, thanks again. Oh, good. I'm glad. I didn't want this to be longer than your reply to me was. I thank you so much for your time and for your explanation. It was fantastic to hear that. I appreciate it. Thank you, man.